The blood on Oliver Lancaster's hands wouldn't wash clean no matter how hard he scrubbed them in the horse trough that scorching August afternoon in 1878. Though it wasn't real blood at all, just the memory of what he'd seen 3 years ago when outlaws shot his father dead in front of him while he stood frozen, unable to force out a single warning word past the stammer that had plagued him since childhood. Now, at 24 years old, he worked as a ranch hand on the Double K spread just outside of Anston, Wyoming, where the summer heat shimmered off the railroad tracks and the mountains rose like jagged teeth against the endless blue sky. His broad shoulders and calloused hands marked him as a capable worker, but his tongue betrayed him every time he tried to speak, turning simple words into tortured syllables that made most folks look away in embarrassment or impatience. The other ranch hands had learned to communicate with Oliver through gestures and nods, though some still mocked him when they thought he couldn't hear, calling him half-wit Lancaster behind the bunkhouse walls. He'd grown accustomed to the loneliness that came with silence, filling his evenings with the leather-bound journal he kept under his thin mattress, where his thoughts flowed smooth and unbroken across the pages in neat, careful script. Writing had become his voice, though he'd never shown those pages to another living soul until the day Rebecca Owens arrived in Evanston on the westbound train with nothing but a worn carpetbag and a letter of employment from the town's only boarding house. Oliver first saw her through the dusty window of Murphy's General Store, where he'd been sent to pick up supplies for the ranch. She stood on the wooden sidewalk across the street, 22 years old with auburn hair pinned up beneath a simple bonnet, her green eyes scanning the unfamiliar town with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Something about the way she held herself, straight-backed despite obvious exhaustion, made his heart hammer against his ribs in a way that had nothing to do with his usual anxiety about speaking. When she turned to enter the boarding house, their eyes met for just a moment, and she offered him a small, genuine smile that made him forget to breathe. That evening at the boarding house dining room, where Oliver sometimes took his meals when the ranch cook was too drunk to light the stove, he found himself seated at a table near where Rebecca served the other guests. Mrs. Henderson, the boarding house proprietor, had put the new girl to work immediately, and Rebecca moved between the tables with practiced efficiency, despite her obvious unfamiliarity with the establishment. Oliver watched her refill coffee cups and deliver plates of beef stew, noting the way she listened intently to each request, and how her smile reached her eyes even when dealing with the more difficult patrons. When she approached his table, Oliver felt his throat tighten with the familiar panic that came before attempting speech. He wanted to tell her the stew looked good, wanted to ask her name, wanted to say something, anything, to make her notice him as more than just another hungry cowboy. Instead, what came out was a mangled "th that died in his mouth as heat flooded his face. Rebecca didn't look away like most people did. She simply tilted her head slightly and waited, her expression open and patient. When it became clear he couldn't force the words out, she said gently, "Take your time, sir. There's no rush." But there were other customers waiting, and Oliver could see Mrs. Henderson's sharp gaze from across the room. He shook his head in defeat and simply pointed to the stew pot, hating himself for his cowardice. Rebecca nodded and brought him a generous portion, setting it down with another of those smiles that seemed to light something warm in his chest. That night, Oliver lay in his bunk staring at the rough wooden ceiling while the other hands snored around him. He couldn't stop thinking about Rebecca's patient expression, so different from the irritation or pity he usually encountered. He pulled out his journal and wrote for an hour by candlelight, pouring out thoughts he could never speak aloud about loneliness and longing. and the peculiar ache of wanting to connect with someone, but being trapped behind the prison of his own tongue. The next evening, Oliver returned to the boarding house for supper, though the ranch cook was perfectly sober and had prepared a decent meal. He told himself it was because Mrs. Henderson's portions were larger, but he knew he was lying. Rebecca was there again, her sleeves rolled up from the heat of the kitchen, a few strands of hair escaping her pins to curl around her flushed face. When she came to his table, Oliver had prepared himself for another attempt at speech, but the words tangled in his throat the moment he opened his mouth. This time, though, he'd brought a piece of paper torn from his journal. While Rebecca waited on other tables, he quickly scrawled a message in his neat handwriting. When she returned, he slid the folded note beneath the edge of his plate where she'd see it when clearing the table. His heart pounded so hard he thought it might crack his ribs as he watched her discover it after he'd finished eating. Rebecca unfolded the paper with curious fingers, and Oliver saw her eyes widen slightly as she read the words he'd written. "Your kindness yesterday meant more to me than you know. My name is Oliver Lancaster. I work at the Double K Ranch. I apologize for my difficulty with speech, but I wanted you to know I think you have a beautiful smile." He'd already left money for his meal on the table and was halfway to the door when he heard her call out, "Wait." Oliver froze, his hand on the doorframe, unable to turn around and face whatever rejection or pity was coming. But Rebecca's footsteps approached quickly, and suddenly she was in front of him, the note still in her hand, her cheeks flushed pink. "Mr. Lancaster," she said softly, mindful of the other diners watching with interest, "I'm Rebecca Owens. I've only been in Evanston 2 days, and you're the first person who's made me feel welcome. Would it be all right if we corresponded like this? I find I rather like the thoughtfulness that comes with written words." Oliver stared at her, unable to believe what he was hearing. He managed a jerky nod, and the smile she gave him in return was worth every moment of anxiety he'd endured. She produced a small pencil from her apron pocket and scribbled something on the back of his note before pressing it back into his hand. When he looked down, he saw she'd written, "I work every evening except Sunday. I'll look forward to your letters." From that night forward, Oliver became a regular fixture at the boarding house dining room. He'd arrive each evening with carefully composed notes folded in his shirt pocket, messages that went beyond simple pleasantries to share observations about his day, questions about her life, thoughts about the books he'd read or the sunsets he'd witnessed from horseback on the open range. Rebecca would collect each note from beneath his plate, read it in whatever quiet moment she could steal, and return her own responses tucked into his napkin or slipped beside his coffee cup. Their written conversation deepened with each passing day. Oliver learned that Rebecca had come west from Ohio after her parents died in a house fire, leaving her with no family and few prospects. She'd answered Mrs. Henderson's advertisement for help because she wanted to start fresh somewhere no one knew her story, somewhere she could build a new life from nothing but determination and hope. She loved reading poetry, especially Wordsworth and Keats, and she'd been saving every penny she could spare toward buying a small cottage of her own someday. Rebecca discovered through Oliver's notes that he'd been stammering since he was 5 years old, when a bad fall from a horse had left him unconscious for 3 days. The doctors said the injury affected something in his brain that controlled speech, though his ability to read and write remained perfect. His father had been patient and loving, teaching Oliver that worth wasn't measured in words spoken but in actions taken and integrity maintained. His mother had died giving birth to a stillborn daughter when Oliver was 10, and after his father's murder, Oliver had drifted west looking for a place where his silence might matter less. 3 weeks into their paper courtship, Mrs. Henderson pulled Rebecca aside after the dinner service ended. Oliver had already left, but his latest note was tucked safely in Rebecca's apron pocket, and she'd been composing her response in her head while washing dishes. "I see that Lancaster boy here every night now," Mrs. Henderson said, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "He's leaving you notes, isn't he?" Rebecca felt her cheeks warm but held the older woman's gaze steadily. "Yes, madam. He's a gentleman, and we're just getting to know each other. He can't barely talk, that boy. You planning on spending your life with someone who can't hold a conversation?" The criticism sparked something protective in Rebecca's chest. "He holds conversations just fine, Mrs. Henderson, just not with his voice, and I've found his written words more honest and thoughtful than most spoken ones I've heard." Mrs. Henderson harumphed, but didn't forbid the correspondence, which Rebecca took as tacit approval. That Sunday, her first day off, Rebecca found Oliver waiting outside the boarding house in the early morning, holding the reins of 2 horses. He handed her a note that read, "Would you allow me to show you the country around Evanston? I promised to have you back before dark, and I've packed a lunch. There's something I'd like to share with you." Rebecca had never been much of a rider, but she found herself nodding agreement without hesitation. Oliver helped her mount the gentler of the 2 horses, his hands careful and respectful, and then they set off into the hills east of town. The September morning was crisp and clear, with the aspens beginning to turn gold against the evergreen slopes. Oliver led them along well-worn trails, occasionally pointing out landmarks or wildlife, and though he couldn't speak the names of things, Rebecca found she understood his gestures and expressions more clearly than she'd understood many people's words. They stopped for lunch beside a creek that tumbled down from the mountains, its water so clear Rebecca could see every pebble on the bottom. Oliver spread a blanket in the shade of a massive cottonwood and unpacked bread, cheese, cold chicken, and apples he'd gotten from the ranch kitchen. While they ate, he handed her a longer note, several pages folded together, and gestured for her to read. Rebecca unfolded the papers and found herself reading the most beautiful description of the Wyoming landscape she could imagine. Oliver had written about the way the mountains changed color throughout the day, purple at dawn and gold at sunset. How the wind through the grass sounded like ocean waves he'd never seen but imagined constantly. How the vast openness of the range made him feel simultaneously insignificant and part of something eternal. He wrote about the loneliness of silence, and how her willingness to hear him through paper and ink had awakened something he'd thought dead after his father's murder. At the bottom of the last page he'd written, "I know it's too soon to speak of feelings beyond friendship, but I want you to know that every note you've written back to me, I've kept. I read them at night in the bunkhouse when I can't sleep. Your words are becoming as necessary to me as breathing. I hope that doesn't frighten you away." Rebecca looked up from the pages to find Oliver watching her with anxious eyes, his whole body tense as though prepared for her to laugh or reject him. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her skirt and pulled out a small bundle of papers tied with string. "I've kept yours too," she said softly. "Every single one. I read them when the boarding house gets too noisy and I need to remember there's thoughtfulness and beauty in the world." Oliver's expression transformed, hope and joy breaking across his features like sunrise. He reached out tentatively, and Rebecca took his hand without hesitation, feeling the calluses and strength in his fingers. They sat like that for a long moment, hands clasped, the creek singing beside them and the aspens rustling overhead. When they returned to town that evening, Rebecca felt as though something fundamental had shifted in her world. She'd come to Evanston looking for a fresh start, a place to build a simple life of independence and quiet dignity. She hadn't expected to find connection, certainly not the deep, surprising intimacy that had grown through folded notes and careful words. But Oliver had somehow slipped past her defenses with his honesty and vulnerability, showing her that communication ran deeper than spoken language. The autumn progressed, and their relationship deepened with the changing season. Oliver continued coming to the boarding house each evening, but now Rebecca made sure to take her break when he arrived so they could sit together at a corner table. She'd bring them both coffee, and they'd spend 20 minutes in comfortable silence while passing notes back and forth, sometimes serious, sometimes playfully teasing. The other boarders grew accustomed to seeing them, and most seemed to find their unusual courtship charming rather than strange. Oliver began teaching Rebecca more about riding, taking her out on her Sundays off to explore further into the surrounding country. She proved a quick learner, and soon they were covering more distance, discovering hidden valleys and crystal streams that Oliver had found during his solitary wanderings. During these rides, Rebecca would sometimes read aloud from books of poetry she'd borrowed from the town's small lending library, her voice carrying across the open spaces while Oliver listened with closed eyes, drinking in the sound of words freed from his own trapped tongue. In October, the first real cold snap arrived, bringing snow to the mountain peaks and frost to the valley mornings. Oliver showed up at the boarding house one evening with a package wrapped in brown paper, which he slid across the table to Rebecca along with his usual note. Inside the paper, she found a beautiful shawl of soft wool, dyed a deep forest green that matched her eyes. The accompanying note read, "I saw this in the window of the dry goods store and thought of you. The color reminded me of the pine trees on the north slope where we rode last Sunday. I wanted you to have something warm for the winter coming. Please don't feel obligated to accept it if it's too forward of me." Rebecca wrapped the shawl around her shoulders immediately, feeling the warmth and weight of it, but more than that, feeling the care and attention behind the gift. She wrote back quickly, "It's perfect and I'll treasure it. Not because of the shawl itself, though it's lovely, but because you thought of me when you saw it. That means more than you know." That evening, after the dinner service ended and the other boarders had retired, Rebecca lingered in the dining room to finish wiping down tables. Oliver had waited outside despite the cold, and through the window she could see him pacing on the sidewalk, his breath making clouds in the lamplight. She knew he wanted to walk her to her door as he'd been doing lately, the two of them strolling the short distance around to the back stairs where the staff rooms were located. When Rebecca finally emerged, wrapped in her new shawl, Oliver fell into step beside her. Instead of heading toward the stairs, though, he touched her elbow gently and gestured toward the small park area near the railroad depot. Rebecca followed, curious, and found a bench where they sat side by side while the cold stars wheeled overhead. Oliver pulled out a note he'd written earlier, and by the light of the distant street lamp, Rebecca read, "I need to tell you something, and I'm afraid it might change how you see me. 3 years ago, outlaws killed my father during a robbery at the bank in Cheyenne. I was standing right there, but I couldn't shout a warning because the words wouldn't come. I've always blamed myself for his death, felt like my stammer made me less than a man, made me a coward. But you've never made me feel that way. You've never treated my silence as a weakness. With you, I feel like maybe I could be enough, just as I am. I'm falling in love with you, Rebecca. I probably have been since the first moment you smiled at me. I had to tell you, even if it's too soon, even if you don't feel the same." Rebecca's hands trembled as she held the paper. Her eyes burned with tears, not of sadness but of overwhelming emotion. She fumbled in her pocket for the pencil she always carried now and wrote on the back of his note, "Oh, Oliver, you've been enough from the very beginning, more than enough, and I'm falling in love with you too, how could I not? You've shown me more genuine affection and respect through written words than most men manage in a lifetime of talking." When she handed the paper back to him, Oliver read her words 3 times, as though he couldn't quite believe what they said. Then he looked at her with such naked emotion that Rebecca's breath caught. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he reached up and cupped her face in his rough palm. Rebecca leaned into the touch, her eyes fluttering closed, and then his lips were on hers in a kiss that was gentle and questioning and full of hope. They drew apart after a moment, both breathing hard in the cold air. Oliver rested his forehead against hers, and Rebecca could feel him shaking slightly. She took his hand and pressed it over her heart so he could feel how hard it was beating, a mirror of his own racing pulse. No words were needed, spoken or written. Everything necessary had been communicated. Winter arrived in earnest in November, bringing deep snow to Evanston, and making the roads nearly impassable for days at a time. The ranch work continued, but became more challenging, with Oliver and the other hands spending long hours breaking ice in water troughs and hauling hay to snowbound cattle. He couldn't come to town as often during the worst of the weather, and both he and Rebecca felt the absence keenly. During one particularly brutal stretch when Oliver had been trapped at the ranch for 10 days straight, he filled nearly a whole notebook with letters to Rebecca. He wrote about the howling blizzards that made the bunkhouse shake, about the near disaster when the barn roof partially collapsed under snow weight, about the strange beauty of the landscape transformed into endless white. But mostly he wrote about missing her, about how the cold seemed to seep deeper when he couldn't see her smile, about his dreams for their future together once spring came. When the weather finally broke enough for travel, Oliver rode into town through snow that reached his horse's chest in places. He arrived at the boarding house looking half frozen, his beard crusted with ice, and Mrs. Henderson took one look at him and ordered Rebecca to bring him hot coffee and sit him by the fire before he caught his death. Rebecca rushed to comply, her heart singing with relief at seeing him safe. Once Oliver had thought enough to function, he pulled out the notebook filled with his accumulated letters and handed it to her with shaking hands. Rebecca clutched it to her chest like a treasure, tears streaming down her face. "I missed you so much," she whispered, not caring who heard. "I was so worried." Oliver reached out and caught one of her tears on his finger, his expression wondering as though he couldn't quite believe she'd shed tears over him. He pulled out a fresh piece of paper and wrote quickly, "I'm here now. I'm safe. And I'm not going anywhere without you ever again if I can help it." That evening, after the dinner service, and after the other boarders had gone to bed, Oliver asked Mrs. Henderson formally for permission to court Rebecca properly. He did it in writing, presenting the boarding house proprietor with a carefully composed note that outlined his intentions, his employment situation, and his promise to treat Rebecca with the utmost respect and honor. Mrs. Henderson read the note twice, peered at Oliver over her spectacles, then looked at Rebecca's hopeful face. "I suppose there's worse matches than a hard-working ranch hand who can string a proper sentence together on paper," she said finally. "Though how you'll manage a household without talking is beyond me. But it's not my life, so if Rebecca's willing, I won't stand in the way." Rebecca let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson." "Just don't let it interfere with your work," the older woman said gruffly, but there was a softness around her eyes that hadn't been there before. "And Lancaster, you make sure you come to Sunday dinner here at the boarding house once a week." Regular courting, proper-like, where I can keep an eye on things." Oliver nodded emphatically, and Rebecca had to suppress a laugh at how vigorously he agreed to the supervision. They'd have time together, properly sanctioned time, and that was worth any amount of Mrs. Henderson's watchful presence. Christmas came, and Oliver surprised Rebecca with a gift that made her cry. He'd spent his saved wages on a beautiful leather journal, far nicer than the cheap notebooks he used himself, with her initials embossed on the cover. Inside the front cover, he'd written, "For all the words you've given me and all the ones I hope we'll share in the years to come. Merry Christmas, my love." Rebecca gave him a muffler she'd knitted herself during the quiet hours after the boarding house settled for the night. She'd chosen yarn the color of the Wyoming sky at dusk, and she'd poured all her affection into every stitch. When Oliver wrapped it around his neck, his eyes shone with emotion that needed no voice. They spent Christmas evening in the boarding house parlor with the other residents, singing carols and drinking hot cider. Oliver couldn't sing, of course, but he sat beside Rebecca on the settee, and she felt his presence like a warm anchor beside her. When someone suggested they sing Silent Night, Rebecca felt Oliver's hand find hers and squeeze gently. She squeezed back, understanding. His life had been silent in so many ways, but now it was filling with connection and love, the kind that ran deeper than sound. January brought bitter cold but clear skies, and Oliver managed to visit town more regularly. He and Rebecca fell into a comfortable pattern of evening visits and Sunday dinners, their stack of exchanged notes growing into bundles that they both kept carefully preserved. They talked through paper about everything: their childhoods, their fears, their dreams. Oliver wrote about wanting to have his own small ranch someday, just enough land to run a modest herd and build a house with a wide porch where he could watch the sunset. Rebecca wrote about wanting a garden full of flowers and vegetables, a kitchen with a good stove, and children someday if they were blessed with them. In February, Oliver began staying after his Sunday dinners to help Rebecca with small repairs around the boarding house. He fixed a loose step on the back stairs, repaired a window that wouldn't close properly, and reinforced a sagging shelf in the pantry. Mrs. Henderson watched these activities with approval, noting to Rebecca that a man who was handy with tools and willing to work for free was worth holding on to. "He's proving himself," she said one evening while Rebecca was preparing for bed. "Actions matter more than pretty speeches anyway. That boy might not talk much, but he shows up, and he does what needs doing. That's worth more than all the sweet talkers in Wyoming." March arrived with the first hints of spring, and with it came changes neither Oliver nor Rebecca had anticipated. The ranch foreman called Oliver into the main house one afternoon and offered him a promotion. One of the senior hands was retiring, and they wanted Oliver to take over managing the horse breeding program. It came with better pay, a small cabin on ranch property instead of bunkhouse living, and the respect that came with increased responsibility. Oliver accepted immediately, his mind already racing with possibilities. The cabin would need work, but it was a real home, a place where he could build a future. That evening he rode to town despite being exhausted from a full day's work. He found Rebecca finishing up the dinner service and waited impatiently for her break. When she finally sat down across from him, Oliver slid a note across the table with shaking hands. Rebecca unfolded it and read, "I've been given a promotion and a cabin of my own. It's small and needs repairs, but it's a real home. I know we've only been courting since October, and maybe this is too fast, but I can't wait any longer to ask. Rebecca, will you marry me? I don't have much to offer except a hard-working heart and a love that grows stronger every day. I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret saying yes. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears as she read the proposal. Her hands trembled as she pulled out her pencil and wrote on the back, "Yes, 1,000 times yes. I don't need much, Oliver. I just need you and a chance to build a life together." When Oliver read her response and his face broke into the widest smile she'd ever seen, he wrote back, "As soon as you'll have me, tomorrow if you wanted, but I know you'll need time to prepare. Would June be too soon? That would give me time to make the cabin livable." They settled on the first Saturday in June, which gave them 3 months to prepare. Rebecca gave her notice to Mrs. Henderson, who pretended to be irritated about losing good help, but secretly seemed pleased that her boarder had found happiness. Oliver threw himself into fixing up the cabin with an energy that amazed the other ranch hands. He spent every spare moment replacing broken windows, patching the roof, and building furniture with wood he salvaged or traded work for. As spring bloomed across Wyoming, turning the brown landscape green and dotting the hillsides with wildflowers, Oliver and Rebecca continued their ritual of exchanged notes. But now their messages were full of practical planning mixed with romantic anticipation. Rebecca wrote about what household goods she'd need and what she could afford. Oliver wrote back with measurements of the cabin and sketches of the furniture he was building. They were constructing their future one note at a time. In late April, Oliver brought Rebecca out to see the cabin for the first time. She'd borrowed a proper riding outfit from one of the other women in town, and they made the journey to the Double K in comfortable companionship, their horses walking side by side. When they topped the rise that revealed the cabin in its small valley, Rebecca gasped. Oliver had transformed the rough structure into something charming. The roof was new shingled, the windows sparkled clean in their frames, and he'd built a porch across the front just like he'd mentioned in his notes. There were flower boxes under the windows, waiting to be filled with the seedlings Rebecca had been nurturing in pots at the boarding house. Inside, the single large room had been divided with a curtain to create a separate bedroom area. Oliver had built a table and chairs, shelves for books and dishes, and a rocking chair that sat by the fireplace. Everything was simple but well made, constructed with care and attention to detail. Rebecca walked through the space with tears streaming down her face, touching each piece of furniture, each careful detail that spoke of Oliver's love and hope. When she turned to him, she found him watching her anxiously, clearly worried that she found it lacking. Rebecca crossed the room in 3 quick steps and threw her arms around him, hugging him as tightly as she could. She felt his arms come around her in return, strong and sure, and they stood like that for a long moment while the spring breeze blew through the open door. "It's perfect," Rebecca whispered against his chest. "It's absolutely perfect." Oliver pulled back enough to cup her face in his hands, his thumbs wiping away her tears. Then he kissed her, deep and thorough and full of promise. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Rebecca saw that his eyes were damp too. They spent the afternoon making lists of what still needed to be done and what Rebecca would bring with her. Oliver showed her the garden plot he'd already tilled behind the cabin, ready for her vegetables and flowers. He showed her the small barn where they'd keep chickens and a milk cow. He showed her the creek that ran just beyond the trees, providing fresh water year-round. Every detail had been thought through, prepared for, made ready for their life together. As May arrived and the wedding drew closer, Rebecca found herself growing nervous about the ceremony itself. Not about marrying Oliver that she was certain of, but about the public spectacle of it. She knew there would be talk about Oliver's stammer, about whether their marriage could work, about how they'd manage without normal conversation. Part of her wanted to simply ride out to the ranch with her belongings and have the preacher marry them quietly. but Oliver surprised her. One evening he presented her with a note that read, "I want to marry you properly in front of the whole town. I want everyone to know that you chose me and I chose you. I'm not ashamed of who I am anymore, not when you've shown me that I'm worthy of love exactly as I am. Let them talk. We'll prove them wrong by being happy." His courage bolstered her own. Rebecca wrote back, "You're right. We'll face them together, and we'll show them that love doesn't need sound to be real and deep and true." The weeks before the wedding passed in a blur of preparation. Rebecca sewed a simple but elegant dress of cream-colored cotton with lace at the collar and cuffs. The other women from the boarding house helped her, gathering in the parlor on evenings to stitch and gossip and offer advice about married life. Mrs. Henderson contributed a beautiful veil that had been her own mother's, a gesture of affection that touched Rebecca deeply. Oliver bought a new suit from the tailor, his first ever store-bought clothing. The ranch hands teased him mercilessly about getting hitched, but there was genuine affection in their ribbing. Several of them pitched in to help finish the cabin work, building a proper bedstead and constructing a chicken coop as wedding gifts. The ranch owner, Mr. Kendrick, gave them a milk cow and said it was an investment in keeping his best horseman happy and settled. The night before the wedding, Rebecca sat in her small room at the boarding house and read through every note Oliver had ever written her. She'd stored them in chronological order in a hat box, and now she went through them one by one, reliving their entire courtship through his careful words. She saw how his writing had changed over the months, becoming more confident, more openly affectionate, more willing to be vulnerable. She saw herself reflected in his observations, the person he believed her to be, and she vowed to spend their marriage living up to that vision. The wedding took place on a brilliant June morning at Evanston's small Methodist church. Rebecca walked down the aisle without a father to give her away, but Mrs. Henderson stood with her as sponsor, and that felt right. Oliver waited at the front of the church in his new suit, his expression solemn and nervous and full of love. The church was fuller than Rebecca had expected, with ranch hands and boarding house residents and various townspeople who'd heard about the unusual couple and wanted to witness their union. Reverend Matthews performed the ceremony with simple dignity. When it came time for Oliver to say his vows, there was a moment of uncertainty. They discussed this with the Reverend beforehand, and he'd agreed to let Oliver write his vows and have Rebecca read them aloud. But Oliver had surprised them both. He'd practiced for weeks with Rebecca in private, working on a single sentence, determined to speak his vows aloud even if they came out broken and stammered. Now, standing before the congregation with Rebecca's hands clasped in his, Oliver took a deep breath. The church fell absolutely silent, everyone leaning forward to hear. Slowly, with long pauses between words and several hard consonants that had to be forced out, Oliver spoke. "I, Oliver, take you, Rebecca, to be my wife. I will love you and honor you all the days of my life." It took him nearly a minute to get the words out, and by the end, both he and Rebecca were crying. But he'd done it. He'd spoken his vows aloud, gift of his voice even in its imperfection. The congregation sat stunned, and then someone in the back started clapping. The applause spread through the church, and several women were openly weeping. Rebecca spoke her own vows in a clear, strong voice, her eyes never leaving Oliver's face. When Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife, and told Oliver he could kiss his bride, the kiss they shared was witnessed by everyone who'd ever doubted that their unusual love could be real and lasting. The reception was held in the churchyard, with tables of food donated by various townspeople and a fiddler playing cheerful music. Oliver and Rebecca moved through the crowd together, accepting congratulations and well wishes. Oliver had a stack of cards in his pocket with "Thank you" written on them, which he handed out liberally. But mostly, he just kept Rebecca's hand clasped in his and let his smile speak for him. As the afternoon wore on and the party began to wind down, Oliver and Rebecca slipped away to where their horses waited. Several ranch hands had decorated the animals with ribbons and wildflowers, and someone had tied tin cans to Oliver's saddle that would rattle all the way home. They didn't care. They mounted up and rode out of town together, husband and wife, heading toward their cabin and their future. The ride to the ranch was golden with late afternoon light, and Rebecca felt as though she were floating rather than riding. Every few minutes, she'd glance over at Oliver and find him already looking at her, his expression full of wonder as though he couldn't quite believe his luck. She felt the same way. This cowboy with the gentle hands and careful words who'd courted her with notes beneath her plate had become her husband, her partner, her home. When they arrived at the cabin, Oliver dismounted first and then lifted Rebecca down from her horse, holding her a moment longer than necessary. He led her to the porch and then surprised her by sweeping her up into his arms to carry her across the threshold. Rebecca laughed and wrapped her arms around his neck, and Oliver carried her inside their home, kicking the door shut behind them. That night, they celebrated their marriage in the privacy of their cabin, learning each other with gentle touches and whispered endearments. Oliver might not have been able to speak his passion easily, but he showed it in every kiss, every caress, every look of adoration. Rebecca discovered that communication went far beyond words, that bodies could speak a language all their own when love was present. They fell asleep tangled together in their new bed, the Wyoming stars shining through the window and a warm breeze carrying the scent of wildflowers. Their first year of marriage unfolded with the changing seasons, bringing joys and challenges in equal measure. Rebecca learned the rhythms of ranch life, waking early to fix breakfast before Oliver headed out to work with the horses. She kept chickens and a garden, learning from the other ranch wives who lived on neighboring properties. Her flowers bloomed extravagantly in the flower boxes Oliver had built, splashing color against the cabin walls. Oliver thrived in his new position, gaining a reputation throughout the territory for his skill with horses. People started bringing difficult animals to him from miles around, and he had a gift for calming even the most fractious creatures. Rebecca sometimes watched him work, marveling at his patience and gentle persistence. The qualities that made him good with horses made him a wonderful husband as well. They continued their habit of written communication, leaving notes for each other throughout the day. Rebecca would find messages tucked into the lunch pail she packed for Oliver, telling her he loved her or describing something beautiful he'd seen on the range. She'd leave replies pinned to his pillow or slipped into his coat pocket. Their collection of notes grew into boxes full of paper evidence of daily love and affection. In the autumn of their first year together, Rebecca realized she was pregnant. She'd suspected for a few weeks, but waited to be certain before telling Oliver. When she finally wrote him a note that said simply, "You're going to be a father come spring," Oliver's reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He picked her up and spun her around the cabin, then set her down carefully as though she'd suddenly become made of glass. For the rest of the evening, he kept touching her stomach in wonder, his eyes full of tears and joy. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the winter, and Oliver became almost comically protective. He wouldn't let Rebecca lift anything heavy, insisted she rest frequently, and worried constantly about her health. Rebecca found it both endearing and occasionally frustrating, but she knew it came from love. They spent the long winter evenings preparing for the baby, with Oliver building a beautiful cradle from pine, wood he'd carefully selected and sanded until it was smooth as silk. One evening in late winter, as they sat by the fire with Rebecca knitting tiny clothes and Oliver carving a wooden rattle, Rebecca looked up at her husband and felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the life they'd built. She set aside her knitting and wrote him a note. "Do you remember that first evening when you slid a note beneath my plate? I was so tired and lonely that day. I'd been wondering if I'd made a mistake coming west. Then you gave me that note and everything changed. You changed my life, Oliver. You gave me love and home and now a family. I'm so grateful for your courage in reaching out to me." Oliver read the note with shining eyes, then wrote back, "I almost didn't give you that first note. I was sure you'd laugh or throw it away, but something about you made me brave. You looked at me like I mattered, like I was worth seeing. You gave me my voice back, Rebecca. Not the one that comes from my throat, but the one that comes from my heart. You taught me that I was enough just as I am. That's the greatest gift anyone ever gave me." They held each other close that evening, the baby moving between them, and Rebecca thought about how the most important conversations happened in silence, in the space between heartbeats where love lived. Their daughter was born in early April during a warm spell that had the wildflowers blooming early. The birth was difficult, lasting nearly 20 hours, but the local midwife was experienced and capable. Oliver sat outside the bedroom door the entire time, unable to help but unwilling to be far away. When the baby's first cry finally pierced the air, he dropped his head into his hands and wept with relief. The midwife let him in shortly after, and Oliver approached the bed where Rebecca lay exhausted but glowing, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in soft blankets. She smiled at him and pulled back the blanket to reveal their daughter's face, red and wrinkled and absolutely perfect. "What should we name her?" Rebecca asked softly. Oliver had prepared for this moment. He handed Rebecca a note that read, "I think we should name her Grace, because grace is what you showed me when you accepted my love. Grace is what carried us through to this moment. And I hope we can teach her to show grace to others who are different or struggling." "Grace Lancaster," Rebecca said, testing the name. "It's perfect." Oliver reached out with one trembling finger to touch his daughter's tiny hand, and Grace's fingers instinctively wrapped around his, gripping tight. Oliver made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob, overcome with emotion. He sat carefully on the edge of the bed and put his arm around Rebecca, and they looked down at their daughter together, a family complete. Grace proved to be a healthy, happy baby who rarely cried and seemed endlessly fascinated by the world around her. Oliver was a devoted father, coming home each evening eager to hold his daughter and help with her care. He'd rock her to sleep singing wordless melodies, the humming sounds he could make easily substituting for lullabies. Grace seemed to love the sound, settling immediately in her father's arms. As Grace grew from infant to toddler, she learned both spoken words from her mother and the sign language Oliver began teaching both his girls. He'd gotten a book on manual signing from a traveling preacher who worked with deaf students, and he'd adapted the signs for their own use. Soon, they had a hybrid system of communication in their household, with Grace learning to both speak and sign from an early age. The little girl seemed to understand instinctively that her father communicated differently, but she never saw it as strange or lacking. To her, Daddy's careful notes and expressive signs were just as valid as Mama's spoken words. When other children occasionally asked why her father didn't talk, Grace would say simply, "He does talk, just in different ways." By the time Grace was 3 years old, Oliver's reputation as a horseman had grown considerably, and he was making good money from both his ranch salary and the outside training work he did. He and Rebecca had managed to save a substantial amount, and they began seriously discussing buying their own small piece of land. They wanted to stay close to the Double K, where Oliver's work was, and where they'd built friendships, but owning their own property had always been part of their dream. In the spring of 1882, an opportunity arose when a neighboring ranch of modest size went up for sale. The owner was elderly and had no children to leave it to, and he wanted to see the land go to someone who would care for it properly. Oliver and Rebecca scraped together every penny they had, and with a loan from Mr. Kendrick as a show of faith in Oliver's abilities, they were able to make an offer. When the sale went through, Rebecca cried as she held the deed to their own land, 160 acres with a decent house, a sturdy barn, and a creek running through it. Oliver held her and Grace both, his family, his purpose, his joy. They moved into their new home in early summer, and Oliver officially went into business for himself as a horse trainer and breeder. The business flourished. Oliver's patience and skill became legendary throughout Wyoming and into neighboring territories. People would travel for days to bring him horses to train, and the animals he bred and raised commanded premium prices. Rebecca managed the business side of things, keeping books and handling correspondence with clients. Together, they made a formidable team. Grace grew up wild and free on the ranch, learning to ride almost before she could walk properly. She inherited her father's way with horses and her mother's quick mind, becoming a bright, confident child who moved easily between the speaking world and her father's quieter one. When she started school in Evanston, she sometimes came home with questions about why other children had fathers who talked and hers didn't. Oliver and Rebecca always answered her honestly, explaining about his stammer and how they'd fallen in love through written words. "But you do talk, Daddy," Grace would insist. "You talk all the time with your notes and your signs. Those kids just don't know how to listen right." Oliver's eyes would fill with tears at his daughter's fierce loyalty, and he'd hug her tight, grateful that she saw him as whole and complete rather than lacking. When Grace was 5, Rebecca became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, and their son was born in the new house on a crisp October evening. They named him Samuel, after Oliver's father, and the joy of having a son to carry on the family name moved Oliver deeply. He wrote Rebecca a letter the day after Samuel's birth, talking about his father and how he wished the older man could have met his grandchildren, how he hoped to be half the father Samuel Lancaster Sr. had been. Rebecca saved that letter like she'd saved all the others, storing them in a trunk in the attic where the paper record of their love continued to accumulate. She sometimes imagined their children finding those letters years in the future, reading the story of their parents' unusual courtship and understanding that love came in many forms. Samuel proved to be as different from his sister as two siblings could be. Where Grace was bold and adventurous, Samuel was cautious and thoughtful. He took after his father in temperament, watching carefully before acting, and he seemed to have inherited Oliver's affinity for written expression. By the time he was 4 years old, Samuel was making up stories and asking his mother to write them down for him. The years passed in the good rhythm of family life and honest work. Oliver and Rebecca's horse ranch became one of the most respected in Wyoming, and they expanded gradually as their success grew. They hired hands to help with the work, and Oliver taught several young men his techniques for training horses with patience rather than force. Rebecca became known for her hospitality, always having coffee and food ready for the steady stream of clients who visited. Grace grew into a capable young woman who could handle horses as well as any man, and who helped her parents run the business. Samuel discovered a talent for breeding horses with desirable traits, studying bloodlines and making careful notes about which pairings produced the best offspring. Both children understood that their parents' relationship was special, built on a foundation of respect and communication that went deeper than most marriages they witnessed. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Oliver took Rebecca back to the spot by the creek where they'd had their first picnic all those years ago. The children were old enough now to be left with a trusted neighbor for an evening, and Oliver wanted time alone with his wife. He'd packed a basket with food, and they sat on a blanket watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. Oliver had written Rebecca a letter for the occasion, multiple pages that he handed to her as the last light faded. By the glow of a lantern, Rebecca read her husband's words about the decade they'd shared, about how every year he loved her more, about how she'd given him not just love but wholeness and purpose. He wrote about watching her become a mother and being awed by her strength and gentleness. He wrote about the home they'd built together and the children they were raising. He wrote about hoping they'd have decades more together, growing old side by side. At the end of the letter, he'd written, "You saw me when I was invisible. You heard me when I couldn't speak. You loved me when I was sure I was unlovable. Everything good in my life comes from the day you smiled at me across the street in Evanston, and then later, when you read my first note and didn't turn away. Thank you for 10 years of love. Thank you for choosing me." Rebecca was crying by the time she finished reading, tears streaming down her face in the lamplight. She set the letter aside carefully and launched herself into Oliver's arms, kissing him with all the passion and love of their first kiss and all the depth and knowledge of their 10 years together. When they finally broke apart, she pressed her forehead to his. "I'll choose you every day for the rest of my life," she whispered. "You're the best choice I ever made." They made love under the stars that night, their bodies familiar and beloved, their passion undimmed by years and children and the everyday challenges of life. Afterwards, lying wrapped in blankets with Oliver's arms around her and his heartbeat steady beneath her ear, Rebecca thought about how far they'd both come from that first nervous meeting in the boarding house dining room. She'd been looking for a fresh start and simple independence. Instead, she'd found grand love, the kind that transformed everything. She'd found a partner who showed her that strength came in many forms and that the most important things were often communicated in silence. She'd found home, not in a place but in a person. The years continued to unfold with the good and difficult moments that make up any life. There were seasons of plenty and seasons of struggle, times when the horse business boomed and times when money was tight. There were illnesses overcome and accidents survived, grief when friends passed and joy when new babies were born to their growing circle of family and friends. Through it all, Oliver and Rebecca maintained their habit of written communication. Even after decades of marriage, they still left notes for each other, little reminders of affection and appreciation tucked into expected and unexpected places. The children grew accustomed to finding their parents' notes everywhere, evidence of an enduring romance that most people only dreamed of. Grace eventually married a young veterinarian who'd come west to practice his new profession, and they settled on a nearby property where Grace could continue working with horses while her husband cared for animals throughout the territory. Samuel showed no interest in marrying young, preferring to focus on expanding the breeding program and writing a book about horse training techniques that incorporated his father's methods. Oliver aged gracefully, his dark hair turning silver at the temples and then white, his face weathering into lines that spoke of years spent outdoors and a lifetime of smiles. His hands remained strong and capable well into his 50s and beyond, still able to handle the most difficult horses. His stammer never improved, but it no longer mattered. He'd built a life where his actions spoke louder than any words could, where his love was evident in everything he did. Rebecca aged alongside him, her auburn hair fading to a beautiful copper gray, her face bearing the marks of a life well lived and rich with joy. She never regretted choosing this path, this unusual man, this life built on written words and patient understanding. When friends from her old life in Ohio occasionally wrote, amazed that she'd survived and thrived in the rough Western territories, she'd smile and think how little they understood. She hadn't just survived, she'd flourished. On their 25th wedding anniversary, surrounded by their children and growing collection of grandchildren, Oliver stood up at the family dinner and did something he'd never done before. He'd been practicing with Rebecca for months, working on a short speech, determined to mark this milestone with spoken words. The family fell silent as he stood, everyone understanding the significance of the moment. Slowly, with pauses and stammers but also with determination and love, Oliver spoke directly to his wife across the table. 25 years ago, I wrote you a N note and slid it under your P plate because I couldn't speak. You could have I ignored it. You could have L laughed. Instead, you wrote back. You've been W writing back ever since in words and D deeds and love. You made my life worth living. Thank you for being my voice when I had none and my heart when I thought it was broken beyond our repair. I love you, Rebecca L. Lancaster. By the time he finished, there wasn't a dry eye at the table. Rebecca rose and crossed to her husband, taking his face in her hands and kissing him soundly while their family erupted in applause and cheers. It had taken him several minutes to get those words out, but they were worth waiting for, worth every hard-won syllable. That evening, after everyone had gone home and they were alone in the house they'd shared for decades, Rebecca sat down and wrote Oliver a response to his anniversary speech. She wrote about falling in love with a cowboy who slid notes beneath her plate, about building a life richer than any she could have imagined, about gratitude for every moment they'd shared. She wrote about looking forward to whatever years remained to them, knowing that their love had been proven strong enough to weather anything. She left the note on his pillow, and when Oliver found it before bed, he read it 3 times before carefully folding it and adding it to the box where he kept his most treasured correspondence. Their love story was written in thousands of notes and letters, a paper trail that documented every stage of their journey together. It was a legacy more valuable than land or money, proof that connection could transcend any barrier when 2 people were willing to meet each other where they were. As they settled into bed that night, Oliver pulled Rebecca close against his chest, his arms wrapped securely around her. She fit perfectly there after 25 years, as though they'd been designed for exactly this. Outside, the Wyoming wind whispered through the trees, and somewhere in the distance, a horse whinnied softly. These were the sounds of home, of a life well built, of love that had started with stammered silence and written words, but had grown into something stronger and more beautiful than either of them could have imagined. Rebecca closed her eyes and smiled in the darkness, thinking about that first note, that first brave gesture from a cowboy who couldn't speak but who had so much to say. She'd read his heart in those careful words, and she'd answered with her own. Everything that came after, all the joy and struggle and triumph and love, all of it had grown from that single moment of courage and connection. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. Oliver's arms tightened around her, and she felt rather than heard his response, the steady beat of his heart against her back speaking louder than any words. Some conversations needed no language at all. Some love was so deep and true that it transcended speech, living instead in the spaces between words, in the comfortable silence of two souls who understood each other completely. They fell asleep that way, as they had thousands of times before, and would thousands of times more. Two people who'd found each other against all odds and built something lasting. The story that had started with notes slid beneath a plate had become a marriage of substance and joy, a testament to the truth that real communication came from the heart, and that love, when it was genuine and freely given, needed no voice beyond its own faithful presence. Years later, after Oliver and Rebecca had both passed peacefully in their old age, their grandchildren would find those boxes of letters in the attic. They'd sit together, reading through decades of correspondence, discovering the full story of their grandparents' extraordinary love. They'd learn how a cowboy who couldn't speak had won a young woman's heart with carefully written words, and how that young woman had shown him he was perfect exactly as he was. The letters would be preserved and passed down through generations, a family treasure that told a story of courage, acceptance, and love that transcended barriers. And sometimes, when the descendants of Oliver and Rebecca Lancaster faced their own struggles with communication or connection or finding love in an uncertain world, they'd remember their ancestors' story and take courage from it. They'd remember that the most important things are often communicated in silence, that barriers can become bridges when two people are willing to meet in the middle, and that love, real love, finds a way to speak its truth, no matter what obstacles stand in its way. They'd remember a cowboy who slid notes beneath a plate, and a woman who wrote back, and the beautiful life they built together one written word at a time.